Today marks the annual launch of the Global Peace Index from the international think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace in Brussels. According to the index, the world has become less peaceful as civil unrest and political instability increased due to the COVID-19 pandemic, with Belarus recording the largest deterioration, along with 73 other countries. Iceland remains the most peaceful country in the world, a position it has held since 2008. It's joined at the top of the index by New Zealand, Denmark, Portugal and Slovenia. Afghanistan remains the least peaceful country in the world for the fourth consecutive year, followed by Yemen, Syria, South Sudan and Iraq. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Mauritius is the most peaceful country, followed by Botswana and Ghana. Nigeria is among the countries with the worst global peace index ranking. Well, for more on that global peace index, I'm joined now from Brussels by the Director of Europe, the Middle East and North Africa at the Institute for Economics and Peace, Serge Stroobants. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, just let's get the broad strokes of that latest Global Peace Index. What's the main takeaway from it? That the world is less peaceful and civil unrest and political instability have increased as a result of the pandemic?
Well, when we established the Global Peace Index, we look at three families of indicators. We look at ongoing internal and external conflict. We also look at safety and security within society, and we look at levels of militarization. Well, in the past years, both the domains of safety and security within societies and the levels of militarization had a negative impact on the levels of peacefulness. A decrease by 0.07%. This is the ninth decrease in 13 years, and it is the second smallest decrease we have ever experienced on the Global Peace Index. And the drivers there are clearly, for the safety and security within society, clearly linked to COVID-19 and levels of civil unrest. We have seen 15,000 violent demonstrations last year, of which 5,000 can be immediately accredited to COVID-19. They were all other social movements. We saw Black Lives Matter in the United States. We saw a lot of protest against the farmer reform in India. The second main domain that is decreasing in peacefulness, or that is generated in decrease in peacefulness, is the level of militarization. We see worldwide increased levels of militarization, and that is clearly a change in trend of what happened in the past decade, where we saw a decrease in the levels of militarization.
Well, I mean, listening to you talk and obviously reading a lot about what's been going on in the world in the last year or so, I mean, there are clearly so many conundrums that have been thrown up by the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, your index further supports that. One of them, of course, being the, as your index pointed out, the global rise in political and civil unrest. I mean, beyond the obvious fact that, you know, the world isn't as peaceful as we'd like it to be, what takeaway can we have from this correlation between the coronavirus pandemic and rising civil unrest? Does that suggest that whenever there is disease or a pandemic, we're going to have that kind of rise in civil and political unrest?
Well, first of all, you need to know that civil unrest has risen over the past decade. We saw an increase by about 250% of the levels of civil unrest, so being general strikes, riots, violent demonstrations over the past decade. This was linked to underlying socio-economic grievances. COVID-19 has just accelerated, basically put a magnifying glass on those existing preconditions, on those existing underlying socio-economic grievances that have not been addressed in the past decade. So you need to look at COVID-19 as an aggravator, an accelerator of something that already existed before. On the second hand, and so when you look at COVID-19, you look at two things. You look, of course, at reduced levels of freedom and liberty, and therefore people demonstrated because they felt that. And the second thing you're looking at is the economic downturn. There, you need to look at the economic preconditions, but also the levels of positive peace, which we do at the Institute for Economics and Peace. With positive peace, we measure resilience. And when you combine the capability of having a very strong and flexible economy together with high levels of resilience, well, you will come easier out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you will have less emphasis put on socio-economic grievances. If on the other hand, you were already having economic difficulties before, if your economy wasn't strong, and at the same time your levels of resilience were low, well, you are going to be impacted more, harder by COVID-19 for a longer period of time, and you will have much more difficulties to get out of the pandemic. And therefore, this longer-term lingering impact of the pandemic can generate more civilian unrest. We saw that the last year with an extra increase by 10%, and if we do not address both the direct impact of the economic downturn, but also the pre-existing socio-economic grievances, that we will see a continued impact of the effects of COVID-19 and a higher level of civil unrest.
That's a very timely warning and also a very incisive analysis that you've given us. And naturally, the next question, because looking through your report, I noticed that was clearly also prominently displayed there. The other issue, of course, the economic impact of this deteriorating peacefulness in the world. I mean, that must be pretty big.
Well, every time we produce a global peace index, we also produce an estimation, a quite conservative estimation of the economic impact of violence. Last year, about 15 trillion US dollars have been invested in violence, 15 trillion. And that's an increase by 0.2%. Now, when you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, you see that the investment in violence has been of about 484 billion. And that's an increase by 8%. So last year, in Sub-Saharan Africa, 8% more was invested in violence.
So, I mean, if it's, I mean, that's an incredible amount of money that is being lost as a result of the increase in violence and deteriorating peacefulness, and particularly for a continent like Africa, where there's always concern about underdevelopment and rising levels of poverty. That suggests that things are going to get worse, basically, in terms of peacefulness.
Well, the drivers of peacefulness, you need to look at the 23 different indicators, and you also need to look at more indicators that come with positive peace, which are basically the investment you make in a more peaceful situation. When you look at the position of Sub-Saharan Africa in this, I would say, ranking of the economic impact of violence, well, this is one but last. Other regions, other continents invest much more in violence. The difference for Sub-Saharan Africa is that I would say the larger portion or the larger part of the economic impact is immediately related to a lack of stability, a lack of safety and security within society, and also due to the results of armed conflicts, where other parts of the world, like I would say North America, the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, well, there you see that the larger portion of the investment in violence is done in violence containment, which means levels of militarization, but also investment made in internal security and safety, so police forces and private and military security company. Overall, for the world, it's about 75 to 80% investment in violence containment, and about 25 to 30 invested in the direct impact of violence, violence conflict, violent crime, suicide, homicide. For Sub-Saharan Africa, the figures are slightly different, and there is a larger portion that is dedicated to the direct impact of violence, and not only the containment of violence.
Well, I want to get into Africa a bit more in a moment, look at the rankings on your index just after we come back from the break. But before we take that break, just remind us what the aim of this Global Peace Index is, because, I mean, the world and its conflicts carry on regardless.
Absolutely. So the vision that we have, or at least the mission that we set for ourselves as an independent think tank at the Institute for Economics and Peace, is to measure and quantify peace, but also the benefits that come along with a more peaceful situation. And those benefits can be economic, social, governance benefits, but also ecological benefits. We want to create more resilient and stronger societies in which every individual can just flourish and develop its full potential. So that's the goal we have set for ourselves. And to try to achieve this, we measure and quantify peace, but we also propose measures to improve the levels of peace through positive peace.
Well, please stay with us. This is an absolutely brilliant conversation, and your analysis very, very incisive, as I said, and would like to hear from you some more, particularly as it relates to Africa. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the latest global peace index. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, our focus in the first part of the program is the widening gap between the most peaceful and the least peaceful countries in the world. According to the latest Global Peace Index, which has just been released, Iceland remains the most peaceful country in the world, followed by New Zealand, Austria, Portugal, and Denmark. On the bottom of the list is Afghanistan, along with Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and Yemen. Africa remains a source of concern because of its glaring underdevelopment and poverty levels. Not surprisingly, many countries on the continent experienced high levels of political instability, unrest, corruption, and wars. Mauritius is the most peaceful country in Sub-Saharan Africa, according to the index, followed by Botswana and Ghana. Nigeria is among the countries with the worst global peace index ranking. Well, the authors of that report are with the Institute for Economics and Peace in Brussels. Their Director of Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, Serge Stroobants, is still with me on the line from Brussels. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. We appreciate your presence and your analysis. And just looking more specifically at Africa, give us a sense of the best and the worst performers on the continent.
Well, as you said, Mauritius, Ghana, Botswana, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Senegal, this would be the top of your index. If you go down to the bottom of your region, well, let's start at position 39 out of 44, Nigeria, and then I go down, Mali, Central African Republic, DRC, Somalia, and South Sudan. Well, when you look at the bottom, those are all countries that are involved either in a conflict, clearly a conflict, or facing with some form of insurgency on their own soil. So this is a continued trend of the past 10 years. Well, when we look at the 2% decrease globally in peacefulness in the past 10 years, then clearly we see that it's ongoing conflict that has generated this. Those are long-term conflict, lingering conflicts with permanent levels of violence and destabilization. At the Institute for Economics and Peace last year, we produced together with the UN Development Programme research on the economic impact of violence caused by violent extremism, which is only one factor, but one important factor on the levels of peacefulness, but also the economic impact. And we did that for 18 different countries, where we saw that in those countries, a percentage of about 30 to 40% of the GDP was spent on violent and the effects of violent extremism. When such a large portion of the GDP is dedicated to violence, well, there can't be any other priorities for the governments and for the investment in a more peaceful society, in a more resilient society. So I guess that's what we are looking at. Now, the good news, and of course, when you look at most of the countries on at the bottom of our global peace index, we see a lot of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the Middle East and Northern Africa. Well, when you look at the bottom 5, 4 countries in the bottom 5, South Sudan, Iraq, Syria, and also Afghanistan, which is outside of this region, improve their levels of peacefulness. So that is something that is somehow positive, even at the bottom of the global peace index.
Yes, absolutely. But just drilling down a bit further on Nigeria for obvious reasons. Obviously it's close to the bottom in terms of the places with worsening levels of a lack of peacefulness. What's responsible for that? Beyond are there additional factors beyond the long-running insurgency?
Well, of course, most of those factors are governance and socio-economic factors stressed as a start. When I look, for example, at what deteriorated last year, well, there was a little bit of everything, but it's clearly within safety and security domain that we saw the largest decreases in peacefulness. And that's all about the number of refugees and IDPs in Nigeria. It's all about the homicide rate that is really increasing. And it's also about a perception of criminality or a perception for the fear of violence. So this is really, in this domain, this is what really sparked off the deterioration of last year. Now, on the longer term, it is clear that terrorism and the activities of Boko Haram, which have been the concentration of terrorism on the African continent, have pushed Nigeria in the position that it is today, and this clearly over a longer period of time. Now we have seen globally over the past 6 years, a reduction in 6 consecutive years, a reduction of about 60% of the global impact of terrorism worldwide. On the other hand, last year, in another publication at the Institute for Economics and Peace called the Global Terrorism Index, that is looking at the impact of terrorism worldwide, well, we saw for Nigeria a decrease by about 30% of the impact of terrorism. I would say in total for Nigeria. But if we looked specifically at Boko Haram or even the Islamic State in the Western African provinces, there we saw again an increase in their activities, and that's a negative sign for sure.
So, I mean, I noticed that you mentioned perception there. How do you achieve your ranking? What's the criteria that you use to construct your global peace index, and how much does perception have to do with it?
Well, the perception of violence or the perception of violent crime is only one of the 23 indicators. It's one of the indicators within the family that is looking at safety and security within societies. This year, for the first time, we worked together with the Lloyds Foundation in London, and we established a survey in coordination with them where we asked different questions. And those questions were, well, do you feel, what are you most afraid of? And clearly there we saw that about 60% of the people would say that they fear violence or they fear the effects of violence. And we asked several questions. So we asked the questions, the percentage of people who are very worried about violence, the percentage of people with actual experience of violence themselves or somebody they know, the feelings of safety about between today and 5 years ago, and also we asked people what is, to your opinion, the greatest risk to your safety. There, the greatest risk to safety, well, security, violence comes in second place after road traffic accidents and just before health issues. When you look, for example, at the percentage of people that already experienced violence or who knew someone who experienced violence, well, the top 5 countries are all coming from Sub-Saharan Africa. Namibia with 64%, South Africa with 58%, Lesotho with 56%, Liberia 55%, and Zambia 54%. So clearly in the experience of violence, 5 countries of Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think those are fascinating figures.
Well, absolutely. But there were also, as you mentioned earlier, there were big improvements in Africa. And the Liberia caught my eye because just a few years ago, it was mired in a civil war. I mean, what has led to its improvement in the index, briefly?
Well, clearly, when you need to look at the index there, I guess what you need to look at is another index. It's the index of positive peace. And the index of positive peace is really looking at those institutions, the attitudes, the structures, the process that you need to put in place to create a more peaceful society. And those investments over time will also have an influence on your different levels of peacefulness. So Liberia was in a conflict, transferred from this conflict into more stability, into a post-conflict situation, and is now, I would say, taking advantage of the investments it made a couple of years ago, up to 5 to 7 years ago, into more peacefulness. Now, when you look at Liberia on this year's index, it actually did not really improve, but it's again decreasing in the levels of peacefulness. So hopefully, this is not going to be a trend for the next years.
And very briefly, because we're almost out of time, it's one thing to come up with an index of global peace, quite another to ensure peace. How does your organization, the Institute for Economics and Peace, engage with countries and the people of the world to help promote peace? And we've got about 20 seconds.
Well, actually, exactly what we are doing at the moment. So talking about the result of our research, the way in which we measure and quantify peace, and also through the promotion of positive peace, through workshops, through information sessions, trying to involve or get engaged with as well international organizations, as well as with governments, but also down to the people in the street, trying to explain to them what positive peace is and the type of investment they need to make to create a better, a more peaceful world.
Serge Stroobants from the Institute for Economics and Peace in Brussels, I want to thank you very much indeed for giving us your time.